welcome you to our concluding Great Books mini-series presentation of the academic year. I'm Andrea Broomfield. I'm an English professor here at Johnson County Community College. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Christine McWord and her staff here at the CoLab for making these events possible, for Susan McFadden, Maureen Fitzpatrick, and Gay Hines, who all do a tremendous job in helping to market and advertise the series, and to video production for filming the Great Book mini-series and hosting it on YouTube. Today's presentation, like I said, will conclude this year's Great Books mini-series, and we'll be returning in the fall, kicking off the semester with a presentation from Dr. Allison Smith, Professor of Art History, so please stay tuned. But today it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mickey McCloud, Vice President of Academic Affairs here at JCCC. Mickey is a newly minted PhD, having just completed his doctoral degree in English Literature and History at UMKC, where he wrote a dissertation entitled The Pen and the Pennon, Political and Social Comment Inscribed Within Chivalric Romance. Mickey completed his undergraduate degree in English at Iowa State University and a Master's of Liberal Arts from Baker University, where he studied literature, philosophy, and religious studies. Of his many professional highlights, Dr. McCloud was most pleased to have been invited to present his work on medieval romance at the International Medieval Congress, the world's largest gathering of medieval scholars. But for work, Mickey finds himself heavily involved in administration, not chivalric romance. Before arriving at JCCC, he served as the Dean of Instruction at Metropolitan Community College's Blue River campus. He will be speaking today on one of his favorite works, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and he would like you to know that his love of knights and heroes likely was the result of a lifelong interest in comic books and superhero movies. In fact, he classifies himself as a junkie when it comes to this particular hobby. And so to listen carefully, or we should listen carefully for interesting parallels between Gawain and then I'll leave that up to him. Without further ado, Dr. McCloud.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it when people actually want to hear about like really dusty old stuff that I like. And it's always interesting to talk about Gawain and the Green Knight because most people have heard of it. Almost no one has actually read it. And so it's always of interest to get to talk to people a little bit about the story. The approach that I'll take today really is one of the approaches that I've taken in my work, which is that this particular story is different than a lot of other medieval romances in that it shifts the way in which we think about knights, and it is done so kind of purposely. So you'll get a little propaganda along with this conversation and a lot of history at the beginning, because I like to kind of make sure that we put it in context so that we have a good understanding of where we're headed. So Gawain and the Green Knight, and you'll find that my accent is always mispronouncing it, which is interesting because it is actually Gawain if pronounced properly. I am an American Midwesterner. We notoriously don't pronounce things correctly. That's just kind of the way we do things. So let's start with first the era of Middle English Romance. Middle English Romance is a very particular group of writings. The genre really only exists for about 150 or so years. It really comes into being in 1330 when the Tale of Sir Orfeo was transcribed out of French into the vernacular. Middle English is not a capstone language, but it really is the foundation of the modern English language. Old English really looks a lot more like modern German than it does like English. So the name is a little bit of a misnomer. It's more connected to the bloodlines of the Angles than it is actually to the language itself, which is much more historically connected to German. Middle English, however, was the language which was spoken by the common people. And before the period of the 1300s, works were either done in French if they were considered works worthy of the aristocracy, or they were written in Latin if they were considered works worthy of the church and of religious philosophical kind of belief. And so the brackets of the era really are Sir Orfeo in 1330, and then the complete works of Malory, which were published in 1485. Malory is an interesting figure because there has always been a certain amount of debate about which Thomas Malory. There are three possible Thomas Malorys. That is a completely separate lecture. I have my own belief, and this is part of where you get the propaganda. I actually believe that the Thomas Malory who wrote these works was Thomas Malory of Papworth St. Agnes. This would actually be his family's crest down through the years, as opposed to Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel, who some of my colleagues sternly believe was the actual man. I think there are too many gaps in his history that don't coincide with these works to actually make that argument, but that's one of those things that we enjoy arguing about for no reason because we're academics and we do that. Romance itself is defined differently than we think of it. Most people, when I go places to talk about romance, hear the word Middle English romance and they think, those books about the Highlands with Fabio on the front with no shirt and, swooning women and pirates. And that's not what romance is. That's modern romance. Medieval romance is actually designed as the intersection between the idea of that kind of love, fin amour, which is fine love, love that is unrequited, that is pure, that is in the respects of this time period almost holy, mixed with the Matter of Britain, which is a series of Latin works that actually tell the myth history of the nation itself. So the figure of King Arthur plays prominently into almost all major romances that survive from that era. He is, even when not present in the stories, a defining kind of tie through most of the romance genres. Now, there are actual figures who had romances written about them. The most well-known is Richard I, who actually had a romance written about his life just as he was passing away. And so Richard the Lionheart actually is a story which he would have been able to have read about himself. Much embellished when you look at the actual history of the individual. We give credit for the invention of romance as a genre to Chrétien de Troyes, who brought these pieces together in the French court. It was brought to England in French by Eleanor of Aquitaine when she became queen. Her grandfather was a huge patron of the arts and actually was a patron of Chrétien in particular. And so these stories would have been stories that she grew up with, and it was entertainment brought with her and her retinue when she came across the channel. The full force of British myth history, however, was really pulled forward in an earlier time period. There is a myth history called the Brute. The reason it is called the Brute is because just like every civilization, Americans always tie themselves back to stories of George Washington and the cherry tree. The English tied themselves all the way back, as all classical civilizations did, to the ancient Greeks. They did so through the Trojan War. The Greeks actually argued that there was one civilization and that the great civilizations all spawned from it. And so in medieval times, you see a number of stories that all begin with this idea that everyone is connected somehow in a root way back to one of the major gods, one of the major kings of the Greek Empire. The British believe that they are actually connected all the way back to Brutus, who, if you know your Shakespeare, was one of the conspirators who overthrew Caesar. And so they have connected themselves through a story which is called the Brute. Now, the Brute has been written twice. Laman's Brute, which was the original version of that story, was translated twice. Once by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was a monk who wrote it in Latin in 1138. And then it was recast again by Wass in 1155, bringing the story forward into an Anglo-Norman tradition so that people could still read this connection of what they believe was their entire civilization all the way back to the Great Trojan War and all of these pieces. The story of Gawain is interesting because it exists in one place. There is only one extant manuscript carrying Sir Gawain the Green Knight, and it is also a manuscript which carries another major piece or bookend called the Pearl. Gawain actually is the last piece in the manuscript. The Pearl is actually the first. We have no idea who wrote it, but we do know that it was all written in one hand, and so one author is given credit for the entire thing. Depending on whether you are a Pearl scholar or a Gawain scholar, you refer to that individual as the Pearl poet or the Gawain poet. That is yet another one of those medieval kind of arguments. The piece is in and of itself different than other romances, because most romances are tales of daring do, which is really how I got here from superhero comic books. Most knights in romance defeat 50, 100 men by themselves, usually with a broken sword and a crippled horse. There's always like a serious amount of hyperbole involved in a good romance. And yet, Gawain is different because there is not one major battle anywhere in the story. It is one of the most popular and most read pieces, and yet it differentiates itself from the entire field by not having most of the markers that define the field. That's one of the things that makes it most interesting. Gawain exists as 2,532 lines at the end of a manuscript that is filled with religious allegory. And the Pearl actually is a story about a man who loses his daughter and in a fit of depression seeks to commit suicide by a lake. But instead of successfully completing the suicide, he passes out from loss of blood, and on the other side of the lake, the New Jerusalem arises, and his daughter walks out because she lives in heaven and talks to him across the water about how it's not his time, that God would not want these things, and that she is happy, she's a bride of Christ. There's all of this symbolism and allegory as she talks to him about the important things that he has left to do in this world. And he considers that having lost her, he has lost the only thing of worth in his life. You know, he is alone. She was the great joy of his existence, and hence she was his pearl. The other pieces that follow are a piece called Cleanness, which actually talks about the ability of a human being to understand God by freeing themselves from the earthly shackles of sin and becoming completely clean, wiping themselves free of sin. And a piece called Patience, which is actually based on Jonah and the whale, the story of Jonah and the whale. And so you find all of these religious allegories. There are also a series of homilies and at least two named pieces that are actually sermons. And then at the end, you get this. So it's very oddly placed, unless you really read into the story that it is using romance for a very specific reason. One of the reasons that my dissertation talks about inscribing political beliefs into romance is because romance characters are stock figures that everyone would have had commerce with. They would have understood them. In the same way that American propagandists designed Captain America in the 1940s to forward the idea of American heroism against a Nazi threat. In that way, knights were deployed to bring out this same kind of idea that there is a heroism to being British, that British heroism is special, and that it is contained within these individuals more so than anyone else. When you think about the manuscript it exists in is British Library manuscript Cotton Nero A10, which is circa 1400. My research actually argues that Gawain the Green Knight was probably written slightly before 1400, and this is actually the latest point at which one might be able to argue that it was actually written. I would argue that it was actually written in about 1377, toward the end of the reign of Richard II, who ended his time as king in 1399. Primarily because the allegories within the story actually coincide with issues that the king was dealing with in maintaining connection with his nobles who started to lose faith in him and his abilities. This is actually a bad scan of the first page. You'll notice there's a dragon head that kind of comes off. Now, there are no dragons, ironically, in this story, and yet because knights are always associated with them, there's a dragon head kind of tailed onto the first letter in opening of the piece to connect you to the idea that this is a knightly tale. It is tied to. So there is a view that the pictures are just as important as anything else. Now, the story itself. The story opens in a basic Arthurian way. Almost all Arthurian tales start with a feast. We all like food. We work on a campus that lives around food. Andrea writes about food. Even Arthurian people begin with food. Almost all Arthurian stories start at a feast, usually midwinter feast, Easter feast, or summer solstice feast. Pretty much start every Arthurian tale. This one happens to begin at Christmas. They're getting ready for the midwinter feast at Christmas. They're getting ready to enjoy a huge party. Arthur is notorious for refusing to actually let anybody eat until something miraculous happens. Somebody has to tell a story, there has to be an adventure, something has to happen before anybody's allowed to eat. And so people usually try and come up with things. If you actually read a lot of Arthurian literature, you will find that his brother, Sir Kay, who is generally an idiot and probably one of my least favorite characters in all of Arthurian lore, usually goes out of his way to like antagonize someone to make something happen because we'd all like to eat before the food gets cold, and he's not going to let us eat until something happens. So we have to instigate something to happen. In this case, however, it's something different. There are things that are uncommon in the way that we open this. Gawain is young at the beginning of this tale, and yet Gawain has to be the focal point. And so the first thing that happens in the Arthurian story is they point out who isn't there. Anybody read Arthurian literature know who the most popular knight was? The one guy who has the supreme authority to do pretty much whatever he wants happens to not be present at this particular feast. They make a point to go out of the way to point out that Lancelot is not there. Everybody else is. Gawain is the youngest of the knights. He is also the least popular at this point for two reasons. One, they do all like him. However, he makes them all look bad, and he happens to be the king's nephew, which, of course, if anybody's ever thought about it, well, of course everybody likes him. He's the king's nephew. If you weren't the king's nephew, you might be a little jealous. And so at the opening of the story, we have to point out that Gawain is famous for one thing at this point, the chopping off of heads. There is a prior work that predates this, that is a Latin piece that is actually called The Rise of Gawain, Nephew of Arthur. Its Latin title, De Ortu Waluani Nepotes Arturi. When you look at Gawain, the most famous thing up to this story being written about Gawain, there are three things you know about Gawain. One, in his original Latin story, he gets tired of being mouthed off to by the Roman senator, and he whips out his sword and chops his son's head off to make sure that he sends a message that you can continue to talk trash, just not about the Britons. And he takes the head and delivers it to Arthur, and he said, "Are these the people that you were all so afraid of? Am I the only one here with any guts?" And so he becomes kind of the bearer of British pride in a very early attempt to see him as someone important. Two, Gawain likes women. Gawain is what is known as the Knight of Courtesy. He is by far the epitome of what you would call a lover. Every Gawain story usually involves him either making out with someone's daughter, stealing someone's wife, or finding a way to get someone's female servants to give him all of the money or all the weapons in the house. Or he is, in a way, a trickster figure, but it's always used through a female character because he is extremely good looking. and he is extremely smooth. At the beginning of this particular story, Arthur is bored. He wants something special to happen before he allows anybody to eat. And out of nowhere, a giant, which is how they actually frame him in the story, rides into the banquet hall on a horse, which even for these folks would have been considered bad manners. He rides all the way up to the dais and he looks at Arthur and he says, "Is this not the kingdom of Arthur, who would be king of the world? If it is, are there not men here who would be braver and bolder than any other and be willing to play a game with me?" Everyone looks at one another. Arthur says, "If you're going to insult us, then I will take whatever game it is that you propose." And the man says, "I propose a game in which we test the strength of your arm. I have here this axe." And he removes a Lochaber axe, which if you've ever seen one, is really long and really difficult to maneuver without lots of practice. And he says, "I will offer any man here one swing to strike off my head, provided that when you've had your turn, I get mine." Now, if you have any sort of common sense, you look at this man and you think, okay, this is going to be a real easy game to win, because after I chop this guy's heads off, the game is over. Arthur says that since no one else is brave enough to stand for the king, that he will do so. Gawain, looking to make his name, says, no, there might be danger in this, my lord. I will take it. He is the youngest. He actually is framed as sitting all the way at the far end. When we look at banquets in medieval times, seating is done by order of importance, from the king in the middle all the way down. He is an important member of the royal family, so he sits at the left hand, but he is the least important member of the royal family, so he sits at the end of the table. And he comes across, he says, "No, I'll do it. Since there is no one here to fight for your honor," specifically meaning Lancelot, who happens to be his best friend in most of the tales, says, "I will take this upon myself. This man is a fool anyway. I believe that with one strong stroke I can end this whole thing." He goes over, he takes the challenge, everyone laughs, they think it's hilarious. He picks up the Lochaber, he practices a couple of times, he takes a swing, off comes the guy's head. However, when you actually look at the piece, you find a couple of things. You find that Arthur recognizes, and this is actually from the manuscript itself, the body doesn't fall. The body actually stands erect, walks across the room to where the head is, grabs the head by the hair, lifts it up, turns, faces the head toward the crowd, and the head says, "Ah, well done. I believe it is my turn next. However, I will allow you 1 year to settle your affairs before I am allowed my turn." Well, nobody really knows what to do with that. You don't really assume that an insane giant man is going to come in and tell you to chop his head off, and then the head will continue to talk to you about when he will take his turn. Gawain now recognizes he's in a little bit over his head, pun intended. He has no choice now but to live up to his word. My argument is that because there are no battles in this, this is not simply about knightly prowess. This is a story about contracts, which because of the time in which it was written, there was a shift during the time period from the late 1300s to the early 1500s in which knighthood went from being a martial pursuit to being a pursuit where lawyers actually are sir. And so they moved to administrators, to landowners. The title no longer had the meaning that you went to war. Those were foot soldiers. And so we have this moment where Gawain is holding the axe and the body has climbed back onto its horse, holding the head to proclaim that I will see you again 1 year, a year and a day from now. And you will keep your word you swore on your honor. And so a contract is struck. Now most people think, well, he just said this. Prior to this, we find that in a document that we know surviving from the reign of Baldwin I, who was Christian king of Jerusalem from 1100 to 1118, there's actually a promise made amongst the Christian kingdoms that goes like this. He says, if it happens that a Frank makes a claim against a Syrian in court to have what the Syrian owes him, and the Syrian denies owing it, and the Frank has no guarantor for it, the law decrees that the Syrian must swear on the Holy Cross that he owes him nothing, and by way of this ceremony, the Syrian may be acquitted by the court. Once you have sworn by God in some way, that is a legally binding contract at this point in history. And so Gawain, despite the fact that you didn't ask enough questions to figure out whether the giant was actually magic and was going to live, you are still beholden to keep your end of the bargain. So he's stuck. There is nothing he can do. Now, superheroes. People always ask, why would this story actually be important? I tend to ask the question whether folks remember one of the most important kind of moments in current superhero lore. Oh man, and this thing's been having problems today. It tried to shut me out earlier too. It apparently does not trust YouTube. This was the scene when, in the 1980s version of Batman, the bat signal first comes in to Wayne Manor, and Bruce Wayne stands up, realizes what he has to do. He goes down, and there's the scene where he pulls the cowl down, he picks up the boots, he grabs the cape, and then he walks out, and he's for the first time dressed fully as Batman. In that moment, we see one of the most important formative things that was taken from Gawain that still exists. The arming scene that all great heroes undergo. Pretty much every hero movie, from Rambo through all the superheroes, have that moment in the armory where all of the things come down off the wall and the hero turns and he is finally loaded for bear. That is not a unique idea. That actually is stolen from Gawain. Gawain's armor is as important a piece of his existence as anything else. But with his armor, with the costume, just like the old idea that Spider-Man learned from his uncle that with great power comes great responsibility, with that mask comes something special. And in Gawain's arming scene, he waits until it's time for him to dress. And when he goes to dress, he dwells there all that day and dresses on the morn, asks early for his arms, and all of them were brought. A silk tapestry from Toulouse was spread on the floor, and great was the gilded gear that glistened upon it. The strong man steps thereon and seizes the steel. He was adorned in a doublet of deer silk from Tharsia, and then a colorful cape closed on top, which with ermine bright was bound within. Then they set the sabotons securely on his feet, locked his legs in steel with splendid greaves, with polanes added thereto, polished full clean. From his feet all the way up, each piece of his armor is given its own moment as he dresses. Because each piece of his armor actually represents a part of his contract. When we get to the end of the arming scene, we find that Gawain actually carries a shield. And on the front of his shield is a pentacle. And the pentacle represents the 5 virtues that he has sworn himself to in his allegiance to God, but not actually directly to God. In irony, unlike other heroes of his time who swear themselves strictly to the church, he swears himself to the woman. On the inset of Gawain's shield is painted the beautiful face to always stare at him of the Virgin Mary, to remind him of his oaths to her as his patron saint. Other knights have patron saints who are great warriors, who are strong men of faith. He actually takes the one great female saint of his time as his patron. And because every piece of his armor builds slowly to this place, each piece he puts on connects him closer to his responsibility to live purely and to those ideals that Mary would have stood for. Now, knowing that all the other stories about Gawain basically make him a philanderer. It's a little odd that, that in this particular story, his patron happens to be a virgin. Another piece that really changes Gawain, that makes him different than what everybody else understands, is that this story actually makes Gawain almost a saint. This is the story when he is the youngest. All other stories of Gawain actually find him later in life after this particular adventure. And so this author looked at the stories of Gawain, many of which predate this one by 200 to 300 years, and thought, what was this individual before? What was he before he became this hero? And so in a way, it establishes Gawain in a different category than most knights, because there's only one other knight who actually is given aspirations of sainthood. And that would be actually Lancelot. No, Lancelot's greatest fault was that he loved somebody else's wife. That doesn't work. Percival is close, but Percival actually is seen as too weak because he is provincial, because he's not worldly. Actually, Galahad is the only one who is actually given, and by the way, Galahad is also the most boring character in all of Arthurian myth. He exists in one story written by a monk. He exists nowhere else. He doesn't come up in any other tales, including Mallory's story of Arthur, by the way. The Siege Perilous exists. He just never comes to sit in it. He has his own story. The Quest for the Holy Grail is a pure standalone piece. And he is basically a Jesus figure. He never does anything wrong. He never says anything wrong. He never looks at a woman. He's never interested in anything other than his duty. He is by far the most static character in all of Arthuriana. But they create Gawain as this hero. He loads himself up, he puts on his armor, and he says, okay, I'm going to have to go find this man. I've waited now 11 months. So they're at the Feast of Thanksgiving when it's time for him to leave, and he has to figure out where to meet this man. The man told him that he would meet him at the Green Chapel 1 year hence, but he never tells him where the Green Chapel is. So he effectively has from Thanksgiving to the day after Christmas to get himself to wherever this is. So he searches. And it's a really kind of interesting, you skip all of the stuff in between. There's just kind of a huge gap in the story where he leaves, and then you see him, he's bruised, he's battered, his shield is dented, his armor is busted. He's got 3 days to get to the Green Chapel. He can find no one who can tell him where it is, but he's been accosted by dragons and ogres, and they give kind of all of this. He's fought giants, he's done all of these things, which they glance over in like 5 lines. And you know he's bloody, he's beaten, he's starving, and he falls down on his knees, and in keeping his covenant to Mary, he says, Mary, if ever you loved your child, Jesus, and if ever you love me as your son, who has been your faithful protector and the knight who has protected your name, please show me the way. And out of nowhere, beautiful white castle, Marzipan, just out of nowhere, appears in the distance, almost as if through kind of a mental haze. And we find that he's trading. If ever I've given you anything that's been worthwhile, then you owe me this. Gawain begins a series of trades at this point. I've entered into this contract. Now, to keep this contract, I have to fall back on contracts I've made prior. You've protected me. You've given me these blessings. Continue, because I continue to do my part. You have to continue to do yours. This is a contract. And so suddenly, in the distance, this castle appears out of nowhere, and he says, oh, well, this must be where I need to go. He goes there. He meets the lord of the castle, a large man by the name of Lord Bertilac. Bertilac is the founder of the feast. Huge castle. Everybody seems to be happy. No one's sick. There's plenty of food for everybody. He takes in anybody who walks in off the street. Oh, you seem to be a good-looking young man, and by the looks of you, you must be of noble blood, because, of course, nobody'd be this good-looking if they weren't. Come on in. I will treat you as a guest in my house. I will give you whatever you ask for. And so he invites him in. They clean him up. They give him a bedroom. And Bertilac looks at him and he says, it's been a long time since I've had a man of your noble bearing come to be a guest here. And so I would propose that the two of us strike a deal to play a little game. Now, one would think that if the last time you played a game you wound up with your head on the chopping block, you might not want to play any more games. However, Gawain, who still has not learned his lesson, says, okay, what do you want to do? And he says, okay, I have 100 men here in this castle with me who will go hunting with me tomorrow. And every day while you're here, we will go hunting. And whatever I bring back is yours. You, however, are only allowed to hunt inside the castle. Whatever you gain from your time wandering the halls of my castle, you must give to me when you return, when I return at night. And he says, oh, okay, there's nothing for me to lose here. I'm not a thief. I'm not going to take any of your stuff, so why not? But I can only stay tonight because I got to find somebody who knows where this green chapel is. He says, oh, no, I know exactly where it is. It's like 3 hours east of here. Just so, like, you can stay here until the day you actually have to meet whoever this is you're going to meet. He says, oh, okay. So the next day, Bertilac goes out. There is a great hunt. He is chasing a boar. The biggest, meanest, nastiest boar anybody has ever seen, as the way it's described. It actually gores about 40 men, takes the lives of 10 of them immediately. It's a really difficult hunt. Gawain wakes up in the morning, dresses himself, and goes out of his room, and immediately runs into Lady Bertilac, the lady of the castle, who says, you're pretty good looking. My husband's a big man, but he doesn't look like you. And proceeds to attempt to woo Gawain. He tries to get away from her. He uses speed. He runs to the other side of the castle. He gets there. She's already there. He tries to go hide in the chapel. She's already in the chapel. In the confessional, coming out, oh, it's good to see you again. She's everywhere he goes. And so the hunt is actually turned on Gawain. He actually is the boar. But he doesn't realize this. And at the end of the day, she says, well, if I can't have you, at least take this from me. And she slaps a huge kiss on him. So that night, Bertilac comes back. He and his men clean up. They have a huge feast. He brings the head of the boar out. We're going to have this dinner. So what did you win today? And Gawain kind of looks at him and grabs this really large, burly man with a big beard and slaps a huge wet kiss on him. And he looks at Gawain for a second, and there's kind of this moment where you think that he's going to turn on Gawain and go, what was that? But he stops and he looks at him and he says, ooh, you had a better day than I did. But there's also a really interesting kind of homoerotic moment there, because as you're reading the story, you recognize that he's got to give him whatever he got. Had he actually slept with his wife, that would have been a really interesting trade. And so this plays out a second day. He goes out, he hunts a white hart, which has all manner of mythical implications for the British kingdoms. It's fast, it's hard to catch, it's fleeting. She again accosts Gawain. This time she pins him into a smaller portion of the castle. However, she does so in such a way that he has to continuously maneuver his body to kind of not be in direct contact with her. It happens again. They bring back the white hart. He gives him the antlers. Gawain has to give him another kiss, this one with a little grope involved, because she groped him a little on the way. And he says, wow, you're quite the hunter to continue to like get I have to wonder about the security of my household, ha ha ha. Yeah, you probably ought to, considering that it's your wife that is doing all. He's thinking that this is, he's like, maybe the serving women in my house are a little forward. So the third day, he goes out and he goes to hunt the fox. And the fox, of course, throughout all of British and French tradition, is a character of guile. Quick tongue, smooth trickster. That morning, before dawn, when he leaves for the hunt, his wife actually goes into Gawain's bedroom, sits on the bed, and catches him there. Now, the interesting piece of this is that people back then didn't really own pajamas so much. So Gawain is nude beneath the covers when she sits down on the bed. Now, as the knight of courtesy, you've got a problem here. Escaping is going to require that you are naked in front of someone else's wife. Or you're going to have to find a way to talk your way out of it. And she actually recognizes that she has him at a severe disadvantage. And so she says, "Good morning, good lady," said the gracious Gawain. "I shall be at your will, and well does that suit me, for I surrender myself swiftly and seek your mercy, and that is best to be sure, since obliged am I." And thus he bantered back with many a blissful laugh. "But would you, lovely lady, grant me leave then, and release your prisoner, and pray that he rise? I would budge from this bed and busy myself better. I would receive greater pleasure in speaking with you." So he tries very politely to say, "Could you kind of step out of the room for a second? Let me get up, put some clothes on, because then we could have a real conversation. This is a little awkward with me laying here kind of under these covers." And she says, "Nay, surely, good sir," said that sweet lady, "you shall not rise from your bed. It is better to recline. I shall secure you here on that other side also." So then she lays herself across him and secures both sides of the cover so that he cannot move. "And then converse with the courtier that I have caught." So she says, "I finally have you, and you can't get away. For I am wisely aware, Sir Gawain, you are." This is the first time she has truly acknowledged, "By the way, I know who you are. I've seen the magazines." This is and he's thinking, "Oh my God, I do kind of have a reputation for doing stuff I shouldn't be doing." So this is an interesting kind of moment where they bring in they've created this really saintly figure, but they have to acknowledge that there is a pre-existing tradition in which Gawain is just a huge philanderer. And so now he's laying here going, okay, so every other story about me before this one is now coming back to haunt me because my reputation has preceded me. And she says, "Whom all the world worships wherever you ride, your honor and your behavior are highly praised by lords, by ladies, by all who bear life, and now you are here indeed, and we are alone. My lord and his retainers are traveling at length, other nobles are in their beds, my bright maidens also. The door is drawn and locked with a strong latch, and since I have in this house him who pleases all women, I shall while away the time well while it lasts, and say you are welcome to me to choose your own way." So she finally just goes, "We're going to stop beating around the bush, and let's do this." And he is immediately thinking, "I can't sleep with this woman, because then I would have to actually sleep with her husband." Not only that, but I kind of did promise the guy that I was going to honor the guest host code, and sleeping with his wife is really in bad form. Now, the interesting part is I can probably name you 6 stories where he did just that after promising somebody that he would honor their house. So it's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition for Gawain. He finally manages to talk his way out of actually sleeping with her. But in doing so, she actually says, "This cannot be the Sir Gawain that I have heard of. Maybe if I asked a young boy to come in here." Which now is the last thing that she's got is, now I have to question your manhood, because I can't be any more forward. And he has to say, "No, you have me at a disadvantage because you've heard all of these stories, but maybe I'm not the man that you have heard that I am. I am actually a better man than that." And so he actually has to admit, "Yes, I've done a lot of things I probably shouldn't have done, but I am actually a better person than that. And so I'm trying now to walk a different path. Besides which, I am going to die tomorrow, and I would rather die with a clean conscience rather than knowing that I have dishonored a man who has been such a gracious host to me." And she does something that is completely unlooked for. She says, I understand. But then, because I love you and you will not love me, will you at least take this gift from me? And she offers him the green garter. And he says, oh no, I cannot take a favor from you. That would actually be wrong of me. You're a married woman. And she says, well, I think that you might want this since you said you're going to die tomorrow. This is special. It's actually magic. And anyone who wears it cannot be killed. Now we have a problem. Because what's the contract? The contract is whatever I get during the day, I will trade you at night. But if I take this, I might actually survive tomorrow when he goes to chop my head off. What do I do? Now we find that contracts can actually be contradictory. He's got a contract to allow one man to chop his head off, and he's got a contract to give another man everything that he owns. But if I can actually survive tomorrow, there's a distinct possibility that this might be worth it. Now, there is actually a handbook from the time of Richard II called A Bundle of Morals. And in that handbook, which is priestly confessions and homilies for the nightly class, and it actually says, if we patiently endure adversity from our enemies who inflict on us hard words and harder strokes, we will be like those who in time of war put up cushions or straw or anything soft of this kind against the battering rams, so that their walls and towers may not be broken down. To a knight it is the greatest honor. If his sword breaks in battle, his horse is felled and killed, and yet he himself has won and is not overcome. No matter what you have to suffer, even the indignity of breaking your word, as long as at the end you have survived, it's worthwhile. And so there is a practical existence alongside the theoretical, philosophical position that Gawain represents, which is perfection in keeping word and deed tied to one another. And so he is at a crossroads. He has to make a determination about how he's going to move forward. So what he does is he accepts the garter, also accepting a kiss from her, which he then delivers to her husband, but keeping the garter for himself. So he has broken his contract. He has broken faith with the Lord of the house. The next day, he sets out for the Green Chapel. He arrives there. The Green Knight comes forth, says to him, it's time for you to meet your fate. He bends down, lays his neck over the rock at the top of the Green Chapel. He's wearing the garter around his arm that's supposed to protect him. And the Green Knight gets ready to swing, and Gawain flinches. And he stops the axe just before it touches his neck, and he pulls it back and he says, now wait, did I flinch when you did this to me? He says, now be still. He does it again, and Gawain flinches because he's not sure the magic is going to work. He's put his hope in this thing, but he has no idea that it's actually real. And he says, why do you keep flinching? Are you not a man of honor? Did you not strike the bargain that said that you would take the stroke manly the same way that I did? And Gawain says, fine, you've embarrassed me, you've seen me at my worst, go ahead and do it. And so he goes the third time to chop his head off, and he stops the axe, and he runs it across his neck, and he leaves a scar. And Gawain says, wait, that counts? That counts as your stroke. You had your chance. You touched my flesh. That's it. And he says, no, I wanted you to wear the scar. Do you not recognize me? And Gawain says, what do you mean? Do I not? And he says, I am Bertilac, lord of the castle where you just stayed, and you have betrayed me not once but twice. And he points out to him that I housed you, I fed you, I clothed you, and all I asked was that you give me whatever you got. My wife came to you, and for 2 days you were an honorable man, and on the third you kept something because you are a coward. And Gawain is shamed. And Gawain recognizes that he has, in fact, embarrassed not only himself, but Arthur's entire court by proving himself a coward, by not facing his death. And the knightly code would argue that you signed up for this, you go grinning into the teeth of death. You don't fear it. You don't flinch away. You don't jump backwards. You don't run. And in this case, you've now dishonored yourself by breaking your oath, which is the one thing a knight truly has that is important. And Gawain says, who would do such a thing as this to unman me in this way? And he says, did you not recognize one of the members of my court when I took you to chapel to worship in the church? And he said, all I remember is this really ugly old lady. And he said, yeah, that ugly old lady happens to be Arthur's sister, Morgan Le Fay. This was all her. It was her design to embarrass her brother and his court, which you have succeeded in doing by being less manly than you thought when you chopped my head off a year and a day ago. And so Gawain has to go home, and he has to bear the scar on his neck, which he can never hide, that will forever remind everyone that he has failed. And he tells him, and by the way, keep the garter, wear it as a symbol of your shame. And so he wears the garter. Now, the interesting piece of the story is that had this been a Lancelot story and everyone had been defamed by Lancelot not living up to his oaths, the entire kingdom would have mourned. Gawain comes back and points out his failure, tells everybody how he is a lowly man and he has done these horrible things, and they all cheer and throw a party. Because where everybody recognizes that none of them can live up to Lancelot, the actual myth of what Gawain was more important to them than what Lancelot had physically accomplished. None of us can actually live up to the legend that Gawain has already. And so by breaking that legend, you've actually made it easier on the rest of us. And so the story ends in a very kind of controversial way. Gawain speaks to his shame. They question him about his time, and he says, he necessarily noted the nick on his neck that he had caught due to disloyalty at the creature's hands in that game. He grieved when he did tell. He groaned when recalling his blame. The blood in his face did swell when he showed the scar with shame. Lo, Lord, said the knight as he seized the lace, this is the band associated with the blemish I bear on my neck. And so he shows him the garter. And he says, this is the sorrow and the shame that I have received because of cowardice and covetousness that overcame me then. This is the truth, the token of untruth that entrapped me there, and I must warily wear it while I may live. So he swears that he will never take the garter off as a constant reminder of this great failure. And instead of being ashamed of him, the king and all the court comfort the knight, laugh loudly at the story, and lovingly agree that those lords who belong to the round table and their ladies, each bold man of the brotherhood, a baldric should have, a band of bright green bound slantwise around him to be worn in the same way for the sake of that knight. So they all decide, not only are we with you, but because you've actually freed us from your legend, we are all going to wear a green band in honor of the fact that you are actually human. And so they all wear a green baldric as a symbol of the round table from that point forward. Now the irony is, at the end of this entire work, the phrase is inscribed in the manuscript, honi soit qui mal y pense, which means evil to him who thinks evil of it. So the idea is, if you believe that you have the power to judge, shame on you who think you have the authority to judge. The man fought for his life. He was in fear of his life, and he was human just as much as you or I or anyone else. This is actually the crest of the Knights of the Garter, who were formed the same year that this particular piece was written, as a part of the end of Richard II's court. And to this day, there are still Knights of the Garter in the world. And so there's a theory abroad that this particular piece was written specifically in honor of the Knights of the Garter, to point out that even though you have earned all of these great accolades, you still are human. You are still subject to fault. You are still subject to place your own well-being in a moment of decisiveness above something as esoteric as a sense of honor. Now, Gawain proves time and again that he will jump into the fray in front of other people to save their physical life, but when it's something that you think you won't be caught for, what do you do? So the story has a great, important sense of meaning to it, and not a little bit of humor, because there are a number of scenes in which we find Gawain, particularly the ones where Lady Bertilac has him on the run. That entire piece of the story is hilarious. But we find that Gawain is very much a human being. And we see his character later in life come to grips with the fact that he is a human being. In the quest for the Holy Grail, Gawain is one of the 4 knights that they believe will actually be able to obtain the Grail. One of Gawain's great, and he is actually a superhero, one of Gawain's great powers is he was blessed by a holy man in that from dawn to noon every day, Gawain actually has the strength of 30 men. He happens to also be his uncle's champion, and so when trial by combat was the way in which you determined who was right, guess when Arthur set court for? Court was always dawn to 11. And if you brought issue with the king, you had to face Gawain. Everybody in the kingdom understood that you weren't going to beat him. The only person capable of it is actually Lancelot. And Lancelot only does it because he knows the blessing well enough that when they finally come to blows with one another, Lancelot basically just plays defense for 6 hours. And then at 12:01 goes on the attack. Because they're such good friends, he knows that he's blessed. And so there's these kind of moments where Gawain as a character recognizes his humanity in that they go out to seek the Grail, and an angel stops him by the side of the road and says, you might as well turn around and go back, like a quarter of the way through the work. And he says, what do you mean I ought to go back? He goes, the Grail is only for truly holy men. You've lain with so many women. You've made so many really poor decisions and had such a bad temper that there is no way that Jesus would want you touching his cup, so we're not going to let you find it. You are the perfect knight for this world, not the perfect knight for the next world. And he says, fair enough. I'll let him know you told me. And he turned around and went back to Camelot. And he never appears again in the tale, even though he's one of the 4 knights that they believe really has the power to get there. Even Lancelot can't actually get to the Grail. He can get into the Grail castle and they allow him to look in through the doorway to see it, but they won't let him get any closer because, of course, his great sin is loving another man's wife. So there's these moments where even these great heroes have to recognize their humanity, which really sets the stage for the way in which we approach heroism in the Western world today. Romance isn't just a set of stories, it's an underpinning for the way in which we view honor, heroism, contractual obligation, the swearing of oaths. All of these things are highlighted for us within these stories. So they are a tie to our history and the way in which we approach things in this country. Thank you.
It's almost 1 o'clock, so if there's just one question. Yes, go ahead.
Is this saying the end justifies the means?
No, actually, it's saying that the end does not necessarily justify the means, that you have to live with the consequences of making the decision that the end justifies the means. His shame is something that follows him forever, but he is forgiven for it because it is the weakness of a man who simply wants to preserve his own life. But he then has to deal with that for the rest of his life.
Okay, thank you so much.